Well, while they're loading up the program on their system, so I wanted to give you some context to the hydrogen discussion and kind of quickly review what the results have been, at least with the AC Transit program, which I'm most familiar with. You heard Sal Lamas earlier speak to that in terms of what the progress has been and the reliability, durability of the system. And what we really have found over a number of years is that fuel cells and fuel cell buses are really proving themselves in a one-to-one fashion, close as possible to one-to-one replacement for conventional vehicles. And this is a really important fact in terms of relating to human nature and what we experience in the transit industry with our drivers. A large transit system will have 1,000, 2,000 drivers, and really what we would like to do is replicate what they're used to now, how they operate their conventional vehicles. And what we've seen with fuel cells, we've got it up, so I can skip to that quickly. It's the right clicker. You can change it. I just have a couple. So what we've seen is that fuel cell buses operate day in and day out, very similar to conventional vehicles. And you see up here number of hours for the lead fuel cell at AC Transit. Earlier, Sal Lamas mentioned this, referenced it, and he said it was 33,000 hours. And I'll explain that in that when Sal came to AC Transit 7 years ago, he said, we're not running these buses like our regular fleet. I want to see these buses run day in, day out with all of our operators, just like any other bus. And so he has really put, on an average, 3,000 miles a month on each of these buses, some as high as 4,000 miles a month. So he was anticipating the 33,000 hours. They're at 31 now, but they'll be there at 33 fairly quickly. But the bottom line is the bus technology is really playing itself out. El Dorado has a number of buses in service at Sunline and also at Orange County, where the buses, again, are showing this reliability. New Flyer, we are about to launch at both AC Transit and Orange County Transit Authority, the new Flyer fuel cell bus. I will say this, the initial testing and evaluation is very promising for these buses to do a one-to-one replacement for conventional diesel and CNG. If we go to the next slide, I'll just have you change it. So overall, there's still small quantities of fuel cell buses. There's about 125, but we're looking at a growth over the next year or so of 1,100 worldwide. Much of Europe is expanding, and especially in China. Daljit Bawa from Ballard earlier pointed out that the Chinese are now subsidizing a growth of fuel cell because they see the need for both electric drive technologies. Next slide, please. So next one, just one at a time. Bring it up. Can you click it once more? So you've seen a lot of bullets in the last set of sessions, and I'm going to translate from an operator's perspective the 5 important bullets to remember. And I say this from 11 years of experience working at San Francisco Muni with their operations and 15 years at AC Transit. And for a transit fleet operator, there are 5 major challenges. The bus, we believe, is there, very close to being there. We have to bring the costs down, and we will do that with volume. And we actually, CT has a plan to drive that volume down and to get the costs down before HVIP funding to $850,000 a bus. But the real challenge, and I would say not just for fuel cell, but also for battery electric, is in the infrastructure. So what you can't read on this slide, but it shows up on my computer, is the acronym PARSE. It's not a very creative acronym, but it's the only one that fits with the 5 letters that you can remember what those challenges are. So the first one, if you click on it, is the price. And we're going to deal with where is hydrogen and what the factors are that lead to reducing that price. But it is a big issue because hydrogen is not cheap. Next one, please, is footprint. It's really, for fleet operators, it's all about real estate. How do I get, whether it's electric controllers or hydrogen supply, into a yard that is constrained by real estate? It's a very big issue for transit agencies. R is for redundancy, resiliency. What do we do for backup? We live in a seismically sensitive state, and now we're also facing wildfires that are curtailing grid power. And so we need to be able to address resiliency. This is not a small issue. The other aspect of R that's important is renewable. How are we ultimately going to source renewable hydrogen in order to meet the state's goals? And our panel today will address that. S, which is the next one, is the speed of fueling. I mean, if you look at how we operate within a very tight, maybe 5 to 8 hour window to refuel vehicles and then get them back out on the street. That is the simplest approach to a large fleet operation. So speed of fueling is a very critical aspect of this. And then the last one is the equity, the actual cost of entering the technology, building stations. Bill Zobel from Trillium earlier had said that there's a very steep, there was a graph that showed the steep startup costs to install hydrogen infrastructure. But as you expand and scale up the fleet, that's a whole different set of economies of scale. So many of those points are going to be addressed tomorrow, and Jeff Surface is going to lead a panel in the morning, which will address all of these, most of these issues. What we're now going to focus on is the price of hydrogen and renewable sources. So with that, our panel, we have Chris Kretz from Air Products. They're one of the largest hydrogen suppliers internationally, and they are building the largest hydrogen fueling station at Orange County Transportation Authority with Trillium. We have Ryan Erickson with Trillium, who's one of the largest supplier of alternative fuels for fleets, buses and trucks. And then we have Pierre-Germain, PG as we call him, with Air Liquide, another large supplier of hydrogen for transportation applications internationally. And then lastly, we have Arnab Chatterjee with Shell Oil. Shell is the largest fuel retailer in the world. So with that, we'll begin with Chris.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Kretz, and I do business development for Air Products, selling hydrogen fuel and hydrogen fueling stations to a variety of fleet managers, transit agencies, OEMs. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about cost of hydrogen. I know it's a bit of a sensitive subject, but we are in a position to talk to you a little bit about the factors that affect cost. Great. Sorry about that. One more time. Okay, there we go. And so I've listed here some of the factors that affect hydrogen cost. And these are by no means all of them, but they're some of the key ones that will influence the cost to produce it and then the price you might see at the pump or at your transit agency. First of all, project scale. I know we talked a little bit this morning about a very large fleet, but you have to start somewhere with a demonstration project for a bus. And so there are a number of choices you can make, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. Some other factors that influence cost are supply mode. unlike CNG, for example, or diesel, there are some options with hydrogen. Gaseous or liquid hydrogen. Do you want to have it delivered to site? Do you want to make it on site through a couple different mechanisms? And so those are all choices you would have as a transit agency. And companies like Air Products, Trillium, Air Liquide, and Shell are here to help you address these questions and figure out what's the right solution for you. Distance from source, that is the distance from where you're going to get your hydrogen between your depot and the hydrogen source site, renewable content, and market conditions. So those are kind of the high-level factors that we see influencing cost. What I've shown here is kind of a breakdown of the cost in terms of project scale. Now, I know some have talked about how it may be a little easier to implement one type of technology versus another with, in terms of cost, but what I've done here is broken down demonstration scales. So you could do a demonstration scale at 1 to 2 buses and take advantage of the program that SARTA's doing. You could do a 5 to 10 bus demonstration, which would be kind of a medium-term demonstration, or start with a medium-term and move to a longer-term demonstration. But the key factors here that you see behind me are you need to think about, for each solution that there might be, what the different factors are. And so, for example, just to give an example of a 1 to 2 bus demonstration, you could have a temporary fueling solution, like a mobile fueler. And in terms of convenience, to you, having a mobile fueler and a bus on your site is pretty easy, pretty straightforward, not much permitting, not much infrastructure, but it has limited capabilities. And if you go across the row on a 1 to 2 bus demo and you look at total cost, in the general scheme of things, it doesn't cost a lot to do temporary fueling for 1 or 2 buses. If you look at capital costs, very low. So all those are green. But then if you look at a per unit hydrogen cost, it will be quite high for a mobile fueler. And that's because the whole solution is delivered to you in one package. And so that's shown in red. And then if you look at scalability, that is also a very low scale type of solution. And so not really something you'd want to use for scaling up, but something you could use to start out. Then as you go down the chart, you look at 5+ buses, 25 buses down at the bottom. What you see is some other solutions. Second row is liquid provided. And it goes through and talks to you about the convenience factor of liquid and the total cost and capital cost. And the beauty of a liquid hydrogen solution is that it's very scalable. And so we'll talk tomorrow a little bit about the Octa fueling station that we're doing in conjunction with Octa and Trillium. And while that's designed for 10 buses, it can also be used for 25 buses and 50 buses without significant modification. And then you can go much larger to 75 or 100 buses by just building slightly on it and not having to totally replicate the solution. And so this chart gives you an idea for temporary fueling, for liquid fueling, for on-site generation of hydrogen, and then for pipeline, which is another option available if you are near a hydrogen pipeline, such as what we have in Southern California. And it compares and contrasts the advantages and disadvantages of the different supply solutions. And I don't intend to go through every single one of these and talk to you in detail, but if anyone wishes to talk with me further about it, or any of the folks on this panel, I'm sure they'd be happy to do it, because there's trade-offs for each of these solutions. So I've talked about project scale. You need to think about distance from source. Where is the nearest hydrogen? If there's not any hydrogen nearby, can you generate on site? And what does that mean? And those are discussions you can have with any one of the providers here and others to try and understand, okay, what is the best solution for me? But each solution will have a cost impact to you, both from a capital and from an operating cost. So you need to kind of work through that with your providers and figure out what makes the most sense for you. Factors like footprint and scalability also come into play as well. And then if you want to talk about renewables, I know in some earlier sessions we've talked about renewables, and it was stated that SMR hydrogen isn't renewable. Well, that's not exactly the case. SMR hydrogen today is one of the cheapest ways, if not the cheapest way to make hydrogen. And you can make it renewable by introducing biogas into the mix of supply along with natural gas. So that is a factor that affects costs. If you want or need it to be renewable, that will, in today's market, could increase your price, but then you have to factor in other things such as credits, such as the low carbon fuel standard, and weigh that against what might be the added cost to make the hydrogen from renewable biogas. And these things can all be discussed with providers, and we can walk you through options and how to balance the costs. But it's important to understand some of these factors, such as scalability, distance from source, and whether renewables needs to be part of the mix. And then finally, market conditions really play a role in hydrogen at cost at this point. Good, bad, or indifferent, that is the way it is. Right now, the market in California is predominantly for automotive. And so cars drive the market in California today, but I've also put some trucks up on this slide to show you that there are other markets that are using fuel cells that could potentially affect the cost, drive the cost down by bringing scale of usage and scale of supply to this market. And then additionally, some others have mentioned contract terms, certainly longer term contracts. You can get a more favorable price, and then credits as well. And then finally, I'd like to leave you with this slide, which just talks about footprint versus scalability. Those are factors that will also influence cost. So if you have a very tight footprint, you need to think about what solution you might need, and then think about how you might want to scale up and whether your site has the ability to meet the demands of your growing fleet and how you might want to address those with one technology versus another. There are some that are more versatile than others in terms of scalability. And again, these are some factors we are happy to talk to you about. I thank you for your time.
Thanks, Chris. Ryan Erickson from Trillium.
Yep.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for allowing us to come and speak to you today. Thanks a lot also to the ARB for, I don't think I've hit this yet. Thanks a lot also for the ARB to put this together. I think it's really an important session. My name is Ryan Erickson. I'm with Trillium, which is a Loves company. Bill Zobel was here this morning, kind of already told the audience who we were. I'll go over it very, very briefly. Basically, we've been doing CNG fueling stations for the last 20 years under the Trillium brand. We've got about 200 fueling stations out there, all heavy-duty focused. We dispense about 80,000 gallons of CNG per year to transit agencies around the country. The Loves brand bought us about 2 years ago, and we're trying to expand their market from kind of the traditional fuels of diesel and gasoline to the alternate fuels, and that's why they brought Trillium into the family. Loves, just for a little size comparison, does about 13 million gallons of diesel per day. So they move quite a bit of fuel, dispense quite a bit of fuel. Trillium's approach and Love's approach is a vertically integrated kind of system provider. We don't produce equipment. We're not tied to one way of providing a solution, and so our focus is really on just trying to provide the custom approach that each agency, each customer has, and find the right mix of technologies and solutions for them. We do this for hydrogen, we do this for EV charging, we do this for CNG. We have the capability of designing, building, operating, maintaining. We have a lot of experience also with public-private partnerships, doing 29 fueling stations right now for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, all the transit agencies basically in Pennsylvania. I want to take a step back, since I don't think it's really been kind of mentioned yet, and just talk about, why hydrogen, why fuel cells. The why is potentially more range, kind of a quicker recharge, quicker refueling rate, and higher vehicle performance. And I guess the way I kind of think of it is something that's a little bit more similar to your CNG or diesel experiences. We've heard a lot of talk already today about electric vehicles, and again, I'm in no way trying to say anything negative about electric vehicles while I talk about fuel cells. I think that with electric vehicles, with battery electric vehicles, there's a little bit more change to the way your operation is, and I think people are figuring it out and doing a really good job, and like I said, Trillium is here to support that as well. But if you have 500 miles, like we heard about today, and maybe not the opportunity to do as much on-route charging or whatever, then something like the range advantage of a fuel cell electric bus, might be the right solution. And my point being that this is an electric bus. This is a zero-emission bus. I like this picture from Ballard, so I've copied it here. Basically, it's the same electric bus that you would get with a battery electric bus, except that the battery is decreased in size, and then you put in the fuel storage and that battery recharger, the fuel cell, and it's a zero-emission fuel, battery recharger on board. So it is an electric bus. It still has zero emissions, and has the same potential for low carbon as well. Dealing with the price of hydrogen, our goal, and I think everybody's goal here really, is to provide fuel at least $5 or less per kilogram, and that number, I guess, I kind of view as kind of the magic bogey because of what you're used to paying for diesel fuel today. $5 per kilogram, and because of the fuel economy advantages of a fuel cell electric bus versus like a diesel or CNG bus with the internal combustion engine, is such that $5 per kilogram hydrogen is roughly the same as $2.50 to $3 of diesel. So this would give you kind of the same cost per mile for your fuel cost if you can get hydrogen below $5. And we believe that's very possible. And Chris did a great job of already kind of discussing quite a bit of that. It really comes down to where you're located, what your opportunities are, how much space you might have on site to do on-site generation versus hauling in fuel, and then the low carbon fuel standard, I think, is going to help a great deal in that as well. Just an example, and I'll show another slide after this too, about kind of how fuel is made, how hydrogen fuel is made. But one method is steam methane reforming, or SMR. It uses natural gas to produce the fuel, along with a little bit of electricity and water. But the energy cost for the natural gas, which is the primary energy source there, amounts to about $1.20 per kilogram. So you can produce very low-cost hydrogen with steam methane reforming. Electrolysis is taking electricity and splitting water to form the hydrogen. And that price can vary quite a bit, just like electric prices. And it varies because electric prices vary quite a bit. In parts of the country where energy might be 5 cents per kilowatt hour all in, obviously your electricity, your hydrogen production cost is also quite a bit lower. San Diego, where it's maybe 25 cents a kilowatt hour all in, it's a lot more expensive. But you can also then make use of the renewable electric assets that are starting to really take hold in the U.S. with the wind and solar. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for even improvements in the costs I show here. We've seen opportunities if you can start producing enough hydrogen where you can buy electricity at 1 or 2 cents per kilowatt hour, and that produces some very attractive pricing for hydrogen. I mentioned already that one form of producing hydrogen is through reforming of methane, and as Chris already mentioned, you don't have to reform just fossil methane. You can reform methane that comes from a landfill, from a wastewater treatment plant, from organic food waste recovery, dairy farms. There's a lot of other sources of methane. These are sources that are currently being exposed, being sent up into the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas unchecked in many cases, and they should be captured and used and used to reduce the global impact to our environment. So because of that, you have a range of carbon intensities, CI, carbon intensities for steam methane reforming of natural gas. It can be as low as maybe minus 250 or minus 300, which means it is less carbon than even just like solar or wind, which you think of as, which is zero. And that's shown below. You can use solar and wind to produce your electricity for electrolysis. And why this is important is, number one, obviously, again, to try to reduce your carbon footprint, but also with the low carbon fuel standard that CARB has, it's the value to you. So, if you can, get a contract with Air Products or Air Liquide or anybody up here for hydrogen, today that hydrogen cost might be, for liquid hydrogen, it might be something like at OCTA, I think they're paying right around $8 a kilogram. But if that was, hydrogen that was produced from dairy farm methane, gas recovery through an SMR, well, then you might have as much as, I'm showing here about $6.50 in LCFS credit available to it. And that's based on even a price for an LCFS credit that's lower than it actually is today. So this is just an example. So the price, the LCFS credit value is pretty significant here. I think, forget who it was Mark, I believe it was, from AVTA, who has mentioned trying to get to a kind of a net zero on fuel costs, and I think that same possibility is here with hydrogen. It's using the low carbon fuel standard to help get there. One of the things also, we're trying to make sure that we provide a solution that isn't just good for you 3 years from now or 5 years from now, but 20 years from now. And so, the low carbon fuel standard may not be around for 20 years. I'm not sure. I don't think anybody is at this point. But one of the benefits, though, that the low carbon fuel standard gives is it allows you to start developing these technologies and getting them up to scale, so that if 10 years from now the low carbon fuel standard were to go away, instead of a couple thousand kilograms going to the state of California, there's a couple 100,000 kilograms of hydrogen going to the state of California, and all the costs that drop with that. And going back to like electrolyzers, taking that wind and solar power and electrolyzing water to produce hydrogen. Those electrolyzers today, there aren't a lot of them that are sold on a daily basis today, maybe even on a yearly basis today. And so as that scale goes up, those prices are going to come down dramatically. And I think there's people tomorrow that we'll talk quite a bit about that even so. And then just briefly, again, just to I guess make this real, I mean, we are, with help with Air Products and many other partners, developing a hydrogen fueling station right now for the Orange County Transportation Authority. And talking about price and scalability, we specifically made sure, I think OCTA said that in their RFP that they would have 10 buses, but wanted to make sure that it was good for 20 buses. And I know that they've got like 175 buses just at that site alone, Santa Ana base, and they've got probably, 600 or so 40-foot buses in their fleet. So I thought, well, there's no point in just building something for 20 buses and then making them double the price if they want to go to 40 buses. So we came up with a solution that there are many vendors that can provide, that was able to provide them a station that actually will be suitable for them up to about 50 buses. And like Chris just said, we don't have to double the price to go up to 100 buses. We don't have to double the price again to go up to 200 buses. And I think Bill Zobel mentioned it this morning. Maybe it's a 30% increase in price to double the volume of that station. So there's a lot of scalability there, I think, and if it's designed for that upfront, and that's what we did with OCTA, and that's certainly what we suggest for any other customer. That's it. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. Our next speaker is PG from Air Liquide.
So, hello everyone. So yeah, I'm with Air Liquide. For those who don't know us, we are a century-old industrial gas company that delivers industrial gas and services to more than 3 million of customers and patients in more than 80 countries. Oh, I think that's yours.
Yeah, PG, I don't think they had your presentation, or they're not. This is always the biggest challenge of any of these conferences.
So maybe you want to start? That might be easier.
So maybe, why don't we, Arnab, maybe it would be better if you were next, and then PG, you could get them the file.
Sure.
So Arnab Chatterjee, and as I said before, Shell is the largest fuel retailer in the world, and they will be able to speak to what they're doing in the heavy-duty sector. Arnab? Can we bring up the Shell?
Right. Thanks, Jamie. Can we just get it onto full view? Just go to the top.
Yeah, I think one kind of theme, certainly Air Products, the ones that are actively involved in the bus arena, Air Products, Air Liquide, Trillium now, is the capability of really sizing and developing a solution depending on, like all politics are local, depending on where your site is and where the availability of fuel is. And I'm wondering if you can just speak to the impact of volume on volume production supply to driving price down. And maybe I know with respect to Air Products and Air Liquide, you could mention what your plans are with respect to driving that supply up and how that might affect pricing in the short term.
Sure. So we already have 3 plants in the state of California making hydrogen, 2 gas generating plant, well, 3 plants and then a liquefier. We've recently announced that we'll have another liquefier in the state of California to help bring more volume. And we see this as only increasing the ability for us and the flexibility for us to bring down price. And it's the same in any market, that as volume goes up, price can come down just because you've got more demand. You can have longer term contracts. People can plan we can plan for production, and then the customer can plan for utilization.
Yeah, I guess so. On our end, so we've also announced the development of a new source of hydrogen and the associated liquefaction facility dedicated to the supply of the fuel cell vehicles on the US West Coast. To support your point, that's like, I guess we are on the same path, moving from a model where the fuel cell infrastructure relies on existing like production and distribution assets. We are now about to move to like a completely different model where the distribution infrastructure and the production assets are tailored for the new needs of this fuel cell vehicle market. And this includes a reduction in cost, but also the optimization on how we leverage the different renewable energies that are available to us and how we enhance reliability of supply for the end users. So that's really our focus right now and what we're trying to accomplish by developing this new project on the West Coast.
Great. I think we're ready with Arnab's slides, and then PG, if you can work with them to get you there. Great. All set?
Great, thanks.
Yep.
I've got the clicker.
Great.
Let me do a quick introduction. I'm conscious there's a lot of interesting things to discuss. Firstly, the usual disclaimers and so on. You don't have to read all of that. But we've just announced our last year's results, so I'm using the year before's because we don't have those just yet. But just as a good example, we've got about 80,000 people that work for us. I think what is particularly interesting is we have about 30 million customers. And I've just highlighted some of the areas that I think might be relevant here, which is that we do a huge amount of liquefied natural gas. So we work very closely, in fact, with our colleagues here around the gas markets. And this means that we have a good expertise in understanding how gas moves around. What might surprise you, and I haven't put on here, is we're also the second largest wholesale power trader in the US and one of the largest in the world. So we're more diversified than a number of you might think. And so I sit here as a manager for business development in North America for both electric vehicles as well as for hydrogen electric. And in our narrative and in our understanding of where we think the best use cases lie, the bus area we feel is going to be highly competitive for the fuel cell electric drivetrain. Whereas I think we think for the lighter duty cycles, we envisage electric vehicles taking on a more prominent role. And maybe to add and finalize around that, the heavy duty area is something that, again, we feel as we move towards a full decarbonization narrative, which I'll talk about a little bit more, again, the fuel cell hydrogen electric pathway is seen as being preferred. I think one of the bold things we've done is address a 50% reduction of CO2 by 2050. So for those that have been talking about how do you reduce carbon intensity, I think this is a really important clarion call for us, because that's, you might have heard, our executive pay now is linked to CO2 reduction. So we are extremely motivated to get our oil and gas production, but also our new energies production, whether it's biofuels, hydrogen, electrons, or whatsoever else, down by 50%. So this is extremely challenging. I'll skip this, but I think I'll come back to this later on if there are questions around it, because this is a scheme and an example of what we're doing in Europe, where today, if you run Shell biofuels or whatsoever else in your bus fleets, you can actually offset some of your CO2 footprint by contributing to a nature-based partner to reforest or whatsoever else. That might be of something of interest for some of yourselves in the audience. What is new energies? Well, it's mainly new fuels, so the biofuels, hydrogen, electromobility narrative, as well as, on the other hand, the power side. And I, again, wanted to just emphasize that because perhaps a number of folks may not realize the diversity of the work that we actually do. One of the areas that we are focused on is city solutions, and I personally look very closely at how we can work with LA and the ports in LA to make both the zero emission as well as the CO2 footprint significantly lower in the next 5 years. I won't go through this in a lot of detail, but I'd just like to highlight the fact that we've done a lot of work since we started in roughly 2016. And you can see that we've built hydrogen stations in the UK, we've built hydrogen stations in the Netherlands and in Germany. And most recently, we've been building hydrogen stations in the US. So we have some heavy-duty hydrogen stations in California that we can talk to, as well as obviously the light-duty network that is growing, thanks to the support from CARB and from our colleagues on the OEM side. What do we see as the benefits around this? Well, I think it's actually something that Emmanuel Macron talks about, is how do we reconcile the views of people for whom the timescale is the end of the world versus those who think the timescale is the end of the month. I think actually hydrogen captures both of those. So I think in the short run, we see air quality improvements as being critical in areas where today there is no other alternative. And we can go through the maths at some point around what we need to believe for example, batteries and lithium, nickel, and other battery types to get to the kind of energy densities required. In the longer run, what we see is that hydrogen can help reduce CO2 if it's made from renewable or low carbon resources. And I think already Ryan spoke to biomethane, and I won't go into that in too much more detail, but we can certainly speak to that. The other area is, of course, natural gas at scale with carbon capture and storage. And the final area is something that we're working quite closely around, which is trigeneration and electrolysis. So how do you arbitrage between power, which might be stuck because there are no interconnects, and we see a lot of that in California. 300 gigawatt hours was curtailed last year because there was no way to get it onto the grid. So how can you convert that into something that is effective, clean, and useful? So we're working quite closely on thinking about how we can link our wind assets with things such as hydrogen mobility. These are the three areas that we speak about: natural gas reforming, gasification with agricultural waste, and electrolysis. And we work in all three of these pathways. We either work with third parties or we build our own technology here. The other area that we haven't spoken about today, and I won't bring it up too much, is grid balancing. So again, what we're seeing, particularly in certain markets in Europe, and we most probably will see that in Australia as well, is the surfeit or the production of power from renewables starts to destabilize grid. And the only way to think about managing that is through either managed charging on the EV side and putting in stationary batteries, which is extremely challenging for reasons that we'll come to, or potentially by converting to hydrogen. So this is something that we're starting to work on, and we're developing projects in Australia and potentially in China with this regard. We like hydrogen. It's easily stored. It has a high range. It is cost competitive, we believe, on a kilometer basis over 1 million miles or 7 years with diesel, and certainly on an environmental footprint pathway, depending on how you manufacture your hydrogen, can give you up to net negative CO2 footprint. I think we all know how it works, so I won't get into too much of the technical detail. This is some of the work that we're doing. As I said, we've got some stuff in California, in Germany, in the UK, and Canada. And we truly believe that collaboration is the key to success, with H2 Mobility in Germany being, I think, one of those examples where we've worked, in fact, with Air Liquide and others to start to work through collaboration rather than competition at this early stage. I won't talk about the light-duty work today, but I think perhaps this is where we see the near future for hydrogen. So we're working on everything that's been mentioned, compressed H2 gas delivery, how do you get costs out of the supply chain? We think that's where we will see some of those costs to get down to the $5 per kilogram level. How do you improve your SMR footprint? So how can you do it distributed? And how do you then get to the scales that might be required when you have a 300 bus terminal and so on? And that's around liquid hydrogen. What are the things that we play around with? Well, it's really improving control optimization, improving the hydrogen dispensing narrative. So how can you as operators really benefit from the user experience such that it is easy to use, it does not destabilize your current operational footprint, and it gives you the quality on a regular basis that you expect today with diesel. We have a strong R&D arm, and we're working on various bits and pieces here in California as well, most notably with Berkeley. And again, happy to talk to anyone that's interested in the R&D sides of things later on. And I think it just goes to emphasize what we see here for hydrogen is not just a 5-year vision, but a 10 and 20-year vision. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Arne. And then we'll finish with a PG and Air Liquide's presentation. Sure, go ahead. Yep.
How much cost savings? Cost savings.
Well, I would say probably nothing, because that's a demonstration station. It was one of the first stations built. It was subsidized by the state government, and no, the first in Emeryville was only with federal government money, FTA money, and state money. And so really it was for demonstration purposes to show that the buses could work. But really, when it all is said and done here, for an operator like AC Transit or any of the operators here, the operating cost of fuel is what really matters in your operating budget. And so what we're trying to show with all of these experts from the different companies is how fuel, what factors will play into bringing the cost of that hydrogen down to parity with regular fuels. And that's going to take some additional time here. After Air Liquide speaks, we'll open this up to more questions and discussion about the timing and how this might work. Go ahead, PG.
All right, so I'll make it quick.
That's right.
So, okay, so my job at Air Liquide is to develop a hydrogen supply chain that really enable a large-scale deployment of fuel cell vehicles. Where are we talking about? Passenger cars, truck, buses, you name it. What we mean by scaling up is not only reducing the costs. In fact, there is something about cost, but there is also something about making sure that we preserve the environmental benefits and the reliability of the fuel while we scale up. So just to give you an overview of where we think the situation is right now. So right now we have a supply chain model which is based on existing assets, where the key cost component, in fact, of your delivered hydrogen is not hydrogen, it's distribution, where the environmental benefits of the fuel are incentivized, and when the reliability is based on whether the fuel is available at one of these existing assets or not. The model we are about to move to is what we call like the bridge. It's not yet a mature market, but it's no longer early stage. We are no longer talking about pilot project. or about local development. What we want is really to take it to the next level. And this means having dedicated assets, having like a strong investment being done at different stages of the value chain, putting the environment as really the core value of these new developments, and making sure that we have like the dedicated supply chain and the associated backup to preserve the reliability while we are developing that. So how do we do that? Here is a couple of examples of what we've been doing during the last 6 months to build this bridge. We are, of course, not alone in this situation. I guess, like you just saw what the whole industry is doing to make this happen. So yes, we're building this new production unit for the West Coast, but we just announced we took a stake into one of the major electrolyzer manufacturers. We've also ramped up our biogas production in the US. We have announced like very promising carbon reduction targets on the scale of the entire group. And we've also started a pilot plant in Denmark using wind electricity and electrolysis. So really, I guess here our message would be, we are no longer trying to figure out how we do it. We are already like building the future and making sure that it's like reliable and competitive source of energy for transportation. Thank you.
Thank you. So, as I was addressing the last question, and I think it's very relevant, the challenge for transit operators is really, I think, there are many issues regarding the actual station and what works best for each agency at their particular depots in terms of the delivery of the molecule. But the bottom line is that transit agencies have to deal with what it's going to cost out of pocket. And so it may be doable for a small fleet to handle an incremental cost that's pretty significant up front, but they're now facing this 20-year time period through regulation to convert their entire fleets. So I'm wondering if you could each sort of take a look through the crystal ball at a 5, 10, 15-year time frame in terms of where you think what factors are going to really play into the cost of fuel, whether that's gaseous delivery or liquid delivery. What's going to affect their bottom line in the next 5 years if they're looking to commit to some level of deployment of fuel cell vehicles? What's it going to look like in 5 years? And then how are they going to move up in the 10 and 15 year to be ready to meet the regulation? Who wants to start first? Arnhem, you want to?
Sure, can you hear me? Yeah. It's a great question, so I'll be brief. I think from our side, we often think about total cost of ownership rather than purely fuel costs. And we see that over, again, a typical lifetime of these vehicles, let's say, again, 1 million miles, 7 years or whatsoever, the costs are significantly with the fuel and maintenance. We see, in comparison with the electric battery narrative, that we see cost curves coming down for fuel cell stacks significantly on a kilowatt basis. That's important. Whereas you need to manufacture more efficiently, you don't have to build new chemistries. That's something that we observe. From the fueling perspective, we've seen how quickly we can get costs out by about 50% simply by improvements around civils and scale. We think we can get even further costs out in the coming 5 and 10 years, again, through efficiencies in scale and industrialization of equipment parts and improving the supply chain, as well as through helping communities and municipalities understand the permitting processes and so on. So a lot of what you see today in terms of cost stack, we think we can get another 50% out, considering what we've seen in the last couple of years, and I'm confident we can do that.
JB? Yeah. Oh, no? Okay.
I'll talk about the fuel costs directly, although I agree with everything you just said. I think that we're seeing already that there's projects that are being built today that will be selling fuel in 24 months that are 100% renewable fuel. they're going to be able to take advantage of the LCFS credits immediately. And I think that we're going to see that fuel cost is going to be, in that $5 range, just like we're hoping to see. There won't be enough if OCTA did all, 600 buses in one day for that, but I think that still will just generate more and more investments, lower cost equipment, and more low-cost fuel that becomes even less dependent on LCFS credits. And like I said, I'll go back to what I had on the SMR. You can build, if you need a fair amount of fuel, 1,000 kilograms per day or more, or something like that, you can already produce, I think, cost-effective hydrogen through on-site SMR. You have to have the space to do it, which makes it a little more difficult for the transits to take advantage of that, because most of them don't have that kind of space.
Yeah, I would add to that, the LCFS credits, which are now going to be available for purchased fuel, not just on-site production for transit agencies, that they're not going to last forever, but they are helping to bridge that gap, because as transit operators, you really have to think about the total cycle, the total spectrum of work that you have to do to deliver service every day with fleets of not just 10, 20, but 100, 200, 1,000 vehicles. And so the LCFS can really help in this immediate period to reduce the price of hydrogen to make it more affordable as the technology improves and the volume of fuel increases to make it a viable commercial option in the long run. Chris?
I think a lot of good points were raised by the rest of the panelists. The one thing I would add to that is we've been selling hydrogen for 60 years in the industrial market. And one of the things that works well in the industrial market is having long-term contracts so that the agency, the transit agency, has reliability of supply and knows where it's coming from and what you're getting, but also so the producer can put assets in the ground or get equipment that they need and really provide the lowest cost, knowing that there's going to be a supply with that they can count on and that they can base their investments upon.
PG?
No, I guess to come back to your initial question, you said, what do you think is going to change in the next 5 years? I do expect that the fact that there is going to be additional liquefaction capacity dedicated to this market in the next years, I do think this is going to be game changer. Not only because you have a higher payload on the trailers and you decrease your distribution costs, but just because we really feel it's much convenient to manage at the station. You're no longer compressing gas, you're pumping liquid, you can store several days of demand. And all of these things, we do think it's going to allow tremendous cost savings, both on the distribution side and on the operational side of the station itself. So.
Okay. Our questions from the audience. We have a few more minutes. Please, Al.
Hi, this is a question for Arnab. If you could clarify, you made a statement that there was 300 gigawatt hours of stranded or curtailed renewable electricity. Is that California, U.S., just in California?
Yeah, that was just in California last year from NREL data.
So by my quick calculations, that's via electrolysis, that's 5.5 million kilograms of hydrogen that could be produced. So I would say if we could harness that ends the supply problem for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I mean, I think combined with the discussions around liquefaction, I think it becomes very, very interesting.
Right, but we're talking about on-site generation and all of the distribution. Now, you got to have the space for it and the economics of it. But I would imagine if it's curtailed energy, that it would be pretty cheap to buy curtailed energy. So to me, if that's true, that's a game changer for this industry to consider.
Sal.
No, thank you very much for your time to be on this panel. And I actually waited to make comment, and so I heard both sessions, which are really good for the electrical and also the fueling infrastructure for hydrogen. So I do agree with Chris that long-term contracts are important. So let me just share some numbers that I've shared with in other sessions. So AC Transit has 65% of our routes run more than 200 miles right now. There's no electric bus option that is sustainable to run that right now. I think hydrogen can do that, but that's 411 buses. If 411 buses need 30 kilograms per bus, then you're talking 12,330 kilograms per day that we have to potentially fuel. And that'll give you about $15 million per year for 12 years, which really turns into 14 years by the time we receive our money and replace that. So we got to start thinking long-term, not a contract tomorrow or 5 years from now, long-term. And so that's just a good example, and I do agree with that. That's going to help. My biggest concern today is we've always been technology agnostic, and now I have and will have, and by spring, 2 buses running side by side, zero emission technology, and by this time next year, I'll have enough data to understand what I can present to my board as what is a financial option or sustainable option that meets the rock profiles that we need to provide to our customers. I'm very concerned that hydrogen is going to price themselves out of the market if we don't find solutions in less than 5 years.
All right. Lauren.
So my question, Chris won't be surprised by this question, but I did hear the interest in providing long-term contracts. But what I'm not hearing from Air Liquide or Air Products is the interest in smaller sales. A transit agency isn't going to be buying the industrial quantities that you sell to your other customers. So when are we going to see the benefit of being smaller, even long-term? Long-term is easy for us. It's the way we work. But I think sometimes the producers of hydrogen seem to be more interested in a big, they're used to that in industrial sales. I think you vent enough hydrogen to fuel Houston. So let's get this going where venting is zero profit, selling it even at a cheaper price is profit.
Just to respond quickly to that, I think we're interested in small and larger sales. I happen to do kind of a mix of small and larger opportunities, and I'm just as interested in smaller volumes as larger ones, especially with long-term contracts associated with it.
There's one other in the queue, gentlemen. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess maybe for Trillium, I guess from the installation side, could you talk a little bit more about permitting and fire marshal? I know the projects I've worked on, the fire marshal's not, they're always leery of anything that's unusual, of any kind of fueling. So what's your...
Are you here tomorrow? Are you here
Yes.
tomorrow? Great. In the interest of time, there's a panel, and Trillium, Ryan will be on that panel in the morning, Jeff Surface's panel. A lot of those questions like that and other infrastructure questions will be addressed in that panel.
Good. Let me ask you then a replacement question, which is about renewables.
I tried.
Do you think there's enough capacity looking forward 5 years to have enough renewable sources in terms of the biogas to meet these the zero emission requirement?
Yeah, I do. So Trillium, along with 100 other companies, are all developing renewable natural gas assets as quickly as we can. I think there's something like 40-some RNG facilities that are currently operating, and it'll be 140 in 2 years. It'll be 540 in 5 years. I mean, it's a rapidly emerging market.
So I just like to finish the panel. We're a few minutes over time. Keep in mind that what this technology brings is a one-for-one replacement on how fleets now operate very efficiently. Just that's the goal here. One-for-one replacement, same operation in terms of your restrictive parameters and how you operate. And with that, I'd like to thank this panel. If you'd please give them all a hand. Thank you.